Hello and good afternoon. I'm glad to see so many people here today. We're doing a shameless plug for one of our studies, so if you are so inclined, it's 5 to 10 minutes. You can hit the QR code and take it online, maybe even while you're listening to our engaging talk today. This symposium represents a very small part of over 2 years of work putting together a special issue on managing visibility, invisibility, and hypervisibility in the American workplace. You see my co-editor, Isaac Settles, who's sitting here in the front. And I recognize that there were whole bodies of scholarship that were all but ignored in mainstream psychological research forums. Work on marginalized people, stigmatized identities, and the intersectional experiences of individuals within these categories has been largely absent. And so rather than sit around and wait for the field to approach us and to come to appreciate our work, we decided to go into the mainstream and force them to recognize more of the value of this kind of work and to claim our own space. And in doing so, we were able to put together an amazing special issue in the Journal of Vocational Behavior that expands our limited existing research in this area to advance theoretical and empirical knowledge around issues of visibility in the workplace. You can see some of the titles of the works that are in our special issue. We center the voices of marginalized individuals and marginalized group members. We highlight how visibility concerns emerge for individuals in a wide swath of various work contexts, such as faculty and graduate students, those in music composition, engineers, and even janitorial and custodial workers. We also highlight how visibility and hypervisibility as identity-based experiences affect individuals who hold different sets of underrepresented identities, such as lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals, women of color, Chinese immigrant workers. And the issue offers theoretical work on how invisibility occurs, functions, and addresses the consequences of invisibility for individuals and the groups that they represent, and for organizations. And we give individuals further details on how employees navigate and cope with employment under these kinds of difficult conditions. Now, unfortunately, we are not in a position to have all of the papers represented today, but we are going to focus on these 4. And since I'm up here already, I'm going to go ahead and start and present our very first article in the special issue that provides a framework for thinking about visibility conditions and how invisibility, visibility, and hypervisibility provide a framework for our experiences at the workplace. Perhaps this quote from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man will say it all. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything except for me. Lewis and Simpson argued for the need to understand visibility and invisibility as forms of advantage or disadvantage in the workplace that are useful for understanding the experiences of all people who have low status, are numerically underrepresented, and highly distinctive. And throughout my presentation, you're going to hear me use this term of marginalized social group members. And I use this to refer to those individuals who have low status and are numerically underrepresented, those that are devalued in their social groups within a social context. And this would not be limited to, but certainly would include people of color, sexual and gender minorities, women, people living in poverty. And although there has been increasing attention in the organizational literature on marginalized groups' experiences of harassment and discrimination, little attention has been focused specifically on visibility and invisibility among these groups. Here we conceptualize negative visibility conditions as an additional form of identity-based mistreatment that individuals from these marginalized social groups may face. And like other forms of mistreatment, being made invisible or hypervisible is embedded inherently in power. Because being in a position to render someone invisible or hypervisible is something that is done by dominant group members, and it is perpetrated against those with less power. It's supported by social hierarchies and the systemic structures that convey power to some groups at the expense of the marginalized. And what is it that I mean when I say visibility, invisibility, and hypervisibility? Visibility is defined as the extent to which one is fully regarded and recognized by others. And it's often considered to be a desirable state, leading to increased credibility and ability to define oneself and to authenticity, particularly if you're in a position to control your visibility. Visibility itself implies that individuals are perceived in a way that they desire. And in the workplace, this might mean being noticed for your skills or your abilities, rather than being characterized in terms of other stereotypes about your groups. In its most benign definition, hypervisibility refers to being, hypervisibility means being extremely visible, which can be a positive if we're talking about dominant group members, such as being extremely visible as a valued, active contributor to a project. However, for marginalized social groups, negative stereotypes combined with being marked as different to result in them being perceived as deviant. This hypervisibility and perception of deviance leads marginalized individuals to become the focus of increased surveillance from others. And under these kinds of conditions of hypervisibility, mistakes, whether they are real mistakes or they're merely perceived mistakes, are used to confirm stereotypes about that group. And any evidence that could potentially counter those stereotypes is minimized or held suspect, such as thinking, well, somebody did do good work on that project, perhaps they had help from someone else. Similarly, when individuals are hypervisible, their personal identities are invisible, as they are only seen in terms of these marginalized group membership that they hold, such as being the token person in the diversity committee. In contrast to visibility, invisibility refers to a state or condition where an individual is not fully recognized or valued. It could be context-specific, such as being a woman who feels she has voice in her work group of other women, but feels that her suggestions are dismissed when she's in a meeting of her mostly male organizational leadership team. Societal and organizational norms are typically those of the dominant group, and as their power and status allows them to create policies, practices, and standards, this places marginalized people in stark contrast to those representations, where their particular norms and standards are largely stereotyped or absent altogether. As such, invisibility places marginalized group members at a disadvantage because once they are rendered invisible, they are denied recognition, power, and voice. And any of their own group norms that differ from those of the dominant group are seen as deviant. Visibility, invisibility, and hypervisibility are an interrelated phenomenon. We assert that for marginalized individuals, hypervisibility and invisibility are actually contrasts to visibility. They represent different manifestations of the same oppressive forces, subjugation and devaluation. Both hypervisibility and invisibility reflect distortions of individuals and distortions of the groups to which they belong. And they both function to maintain a social hierarchy where marginalized groups are constrained to the periphery. And following, I'm going to detail a number of characteristics that are shared by both invisibility and hypervisibility. And all of these characteristics make them distinct from positive visibility. Invisibility and hypervisibility are embedded in power relationships. Differential power and marginalization are precursors for invisibility and hypervisibility, given that those with status and power have the authority to render others visible, invisible, or hypervisible. Being numerically underrepresented can also contribute to invisibility and hypervisibility. But for example, if we think about marginalized group members that are numerical tokens, have increased vulnerability to both of these conditions. However, we do have some important and notable exceptions, where underrepresentation, power, and marginalization do not necessarily align. For example, if we think about South Africa, Black people represent over 80% of that nation's population, and they are certainly not tokens in many of their work settings. Yet they remain marginalized in society and subject to stereotypes that render them invisible and simultaneously hypervisible. Conversely, token men in women-dominated professions, such as males in nursing, they often experience positive visibility, perhaps even positive visibility uplift, that comes with higher incomes and access to leadership opportunities. So both of these examples demonstrate that marginalization and status matter more than numerical representation in determining invisibility and hypervisibility's outcomes. Invisibility and hypervisibility conditions are asymmetric and can be strategically used by powerful others. The power differentials across privileged and marginalized groups result in an asymmetry around who can control their own invisibility and control the visibilities of others. Invisibility reinforces power and privilege for the dominant groups by cloaking the systems of oppression that maintain their power. Dominant groups can also manipulate the visibility conditions of marginalized groups in order to sustain power hierarchies, such as women being appointed to leadership positions only in failing organizations, the glass cliff. And when these companies continue to perform poorly, their failure is then used to confirm various stereotypes that women are not suitable leaders. In contrast, marginalized group members are rarely able to impose invisibility or hypervisibility on privileged others. Invisibility and hypervisibility manifest differently based on one's status as privileged or as marginalized. For marginalized groups, invisibility is a lack of recognition and being perceived accurately. However, for privileged groups, invisibility works to mask the ways that their dominant status provides them advantages. For example, the invisibility of the ideal worker norm is based on a white, male, middle-class, heterosexual worker. And this hides the ways that white, male, middle-class, heterosexual workers and employees are advantaged by design with workplace policies, procedures, standards, and expectations that suit them well. Success of privileged group members are therefore attributed to their personal efforts and their personal characteristics, like their intelligence or their hard work. And because they are not subject to heightened surveillance, their failures, their mistakes, and their transgressions are often invisible to others. So when marginalized groups seek to make the hidden advantages of privileged groups known, well, we all know how that goes, right? They often experience backlash through silencing, delegitimization, and other forms of social and environmental control. Invisibility and hypervisibility reflect and reify social hierarchies and social boundaries. Given the power and given the status of privileged groups to assert norms and procedures and policies that maintain their advantage, the devaluation of those rendered invisible or hypervisible reflects those social boundaries that are already established between privileged and marginalized groups. Moreover, their invisibility and hypervisibility are often then used to reinforce these arbitrary boundaries, ensuring that the social hierarchy across groups is well maintained. Invisibility and hypervisibility represent distortions in visibility. The way that marginalized group members are controlled by dominant group members distorts how individuals within those marginalized groups are perceived and are recognized. And once they are distorted, positive visibility is unlikely, and invisibility or hypervisibility will ensue. And the visibility of these distorted representations then become the undergirding for further distortion of those very groups and the members within them. Invisibility and hypervisibility are socially constructed. There is nothing proscriptive about invisibility and hypervisibility. And as such, differing social circumstances, social hierarchies, and power dynamics can change the nature and the function of these visibility conditions. So just as race is not a biological construct, but is instead a socially constructed one, those subjected to invisibility and hypervisibility are arbitrarily placed in these precarious conditions due to their group memberships and those socially constructed narratives of those groups. This visibility conditions framework that we offer, along with the various papers in this special issue, extends this construct of visibility to the field of psychology across a number of different ways. First, although visibility is often framed as a negative, undesirable state, or invisibility is a negative, undesirable state, in the theoretical literature, individuals may actually choose to use invisibility strategically. to avoid identity-based mistreatment. Furthermore, invisibility is sometimes desirable for marginalized individuals. In particular, as you're going to hear today, we find that some of the custodial workers in the sample reported that invisibility provided them welcomed benefits, such as being independent from intrusive oversight and having power to choose whether or not to engage with others. Second, because invisibility and hypervisibility are forms of identity-based mistreatment, individuals could use their social identity-based impression management responses, and that might allow them to at least have some influence or control over how others see them and perhaps avoid particular experiences. These could include strategies in which marginalized individuals attempt to be seen as a member of one of the dominant groups. They may distance themselves from their devalued group, or they may use strategies where they are attempting to improve the positive visibility of their group and change the way that their group is seen. Third, despite the possibility of negative psychological and occupational outcomes associated with creating a new visibility narrative about their group, members of marginalized groups often describe that their hope that if they engage in these efforts despite the harm caused to them personally, it will create long-term social change that creates opportunities and an easier pathway to success for those that follow them. Despite making a significant contribution, this special issue is only the start, the very, very beginning of a larger body of psychological research that is desperately needed to address invisibility, visibility, and hypervisibility in the workplace. As such, we offer some recommendations for areas in visibility studies where scholars could take up this charge. First, building on discussions of the ways that the special issue extends scholarship, more research is desperately needed that examines how invisibility might actually confer benefits to marginalized group members. For example, our research shows that some faculties use strategic visibility to buffer themselves from the negative workplace interactions that they typically have, which frees them to actually become more productive. Similarly, there is an interesting distinguishing between an alienating invisibility versus self-protective invisibility. And maybe these things function in very different ways and can be used strategically and positively. Second, although the special issue contributes to our understanding of the experiences of marginalized employees, almost nothing is known about those with power and influence in an organization, and those who intentionally or perhaps inadvertently render others invisible and hypervisible. Greater understanding about the whys and the hows for dominant group members could strengthen the things that they are doing to strengthen their normative status or to retain their power and advantage could actually help researchers and organizations understand how to eliminate these types of boundaries between groups and how to create organizational climate that welcomes and validates all members of the organization. Third, consistent with intersectionality theory, this issue illuminates the importance of not essentializing our categories, not assuming that there is some shared natural quality of any particular group, but rather questioning what types of visibility experiences specific groups might share and why. For example, in one of our studies, to it all note that counter to the vast research highlighting Asian Americans' educational and financial successes, their sample of low-income Chinese immigrants was restricted to very low-paying jobs under extremely harsh working conditions that were largely undesirable, meaning they were repetitive, physically demanding, they worked in harsh factory conditions, working often more than 12 hours a day. Thus, more research is needed to thoroughly understand how these experiences are unique to groups before we rush to establish generalizability across groups. In sum, we feel that research on visibility in the workplace is an important and exciting new area of study. The visibility conditions framework that we've offered, with its attention to the relative power of dominant group members and marginalized group members, and its focus on the influence of unstated organizational norms, makes it well suited to think about the negative workplace experiences of many marginalized groups. The papers in this larger issue demonstrate the significant effect that being made invisible or hypervisible has on marginalized people. and the potential that asserting one's visibility has for empowerment and changing group stereotypes and representations. We hope that this work on the special issue will inspire future scholarship that expands and develops understanding of the role of visibility conditions in conferring power and reifying marginalization.